Night Nook Publishing presents Demon Confessions of Sansa Plath, a short story, written and read by Tracy Daly. Chapter 1. I twirled Miss Bach's threads of sorrow around my finger, the deep molasses scent magnifying my hunger. Not even the burnt coffee and rotten banana peel smell of the teacher's lounge was enough to spoil my demon appetite. Although the fact that I wasn't supposed to be here did make the sorrow harder to swallow. I, Sansa Plath, confess, I ignored the call for all demonkind to report for the gathering, the end of time. The father of demons, Cato Filius, has been preparing for this moment for 1,000 years, but when the announcement reached every demon to report for the final battle between demons and the descendants of angels, I hesitated. There was something I needed to do before the end of all things to satisfy my hunger. I'd been planning to find a way to fill the emptiness in me ever since I leaned over the shoulder of Virginia Woolf and watched her pen The Death of the Moth. But now I was out of time. If I ever wanted to experience the full emotions of humankind, I had to act now. Time was ending. I needed to think of a plan, and thinking required a good meal. When my hunger becomes unbearable, I go to the teacher's lounge at Olympus High School, room 231. The one teacher in the lounge before school was Mrs. Bach, a veteran literature teacher whose classroom I had visited more than once to hear her lessons. She leaned forward, 2 elbows on the cheap folding table, a cup of coffee in front of her that failed to put off any steam. Her hair was pulled back in a quick ponytail, and her shirt was rumpled. She sagged a little as she checked a message on her phone. I resisted an impulse to pat her on the shoulder, an action I've observed in human interactions that I believe have an emotion behind it. Of course, a pat from a demon would only leave the exhausted educator chilled for the rest of the day. I don't find satisfaction in feeding off the sorrow of teachers, but they are a constant source, and I didn't have a lot of time. I'd thought about writing out the end of time in my dark corner of the library, waiting for patrons to pull a poetry book from the shelf and open the cover so I could read over their shoulders. Unfortunately, even in the best of times, the poetry section of the library lacks patrons, readers, or even book graffiti artists. I wasn't picky about who opened the books that allowed me to read the words of ordinaries who could feel so deeply. Poetry expressed the emotions I had a hunger to touch, to feel in my own demon essence. I had a hunger for emotions that almost eclipsed my hunger for sorrow, but not quite. The teacher's lounge was the best-kept secret of the demon world. I often passed fellow demons trying to feed off students, or parents that made the long wait in the passenger pickup line, frustrated that their almost adult children didn't have their own form of transportation. Some demons thought they could get a meal from the janitors in the hall or the football team after a loss. But students, parents, janitors, and even disappointed athletes cling to their misery like a hermit crab clinging to its acquired home. There was sustenance to be had, but it was harder to feed off ordinaries who wrapped themselves up in their sorrow and refused to let it go. Teachers have no time for wallowing in or even processing their sorrow. There were some teachers who clung to their sorrows, but those teachers didn't last long. The teachers who lasted until tenure reminded me of ancient warriors of the past, fighting in wars where demons would flock to feed on the sorrow of death and destruction. The best meals of sorrow were gleaned from those who fought for a cause, who were able to give their sorrow away in the hope of a better tomorrow. Mrs. Bach reminded me of Joan of Arc in her willingness to fight to the bitter end and leave her best self out on the battlefield. She checked the clock like a captain checks the position of their troops before shouting the command to charge. She slurped down the dregs of the bad cup of coffee. She straightened her shoulders and tossed aside the dark sorrow that had been weighing her down. I sucked up the discarded sorrow like noodles from a spaghetti bowl. No need to waste a good meal. I'd be full for days if I had that long. Mrs. Bach must have had another reminder of approaching state aptitude tests. Instead of heading back to the library like I normally would have, I decided to stay for Mrs. Bach's AP literature lesson. Listening to Mrs. Bach's lessons was the closest I'd come to understanding the emotions expressed through words recorded with ink and paper. Maybe I would find inspiration for how to achieve my goal. Mrs. Bach could bring out the song in every poem, express the passion of every novel, and play with the written word like a master violinist on the strings. I tried to taste her lessons with my forked demon tongue, but the taste never matched the colorful display of Mrs. Bach's emotional strands dancing in bright colors, reaching out from her chest to touch the emotions of her students. I've poked a student or two who'd fallen asleep during a lecture on poetry during the 18th century so they could appreciate the threads of light that couldn't touch me. Of course, those students would only shiver, pull their hoodie over their head, and snap at people for the rest of the day. If they only knew how lucky they were to be able to feel all the things the poets describe: love, interest, excitement, beauty, hope, passion. Instead, they turned on those small screens and pushed the emotions inside, leaving both themselves and sorrow-hungry demons completely starved. I skirted around the students waiting outside the door as they shoved inside the last few seconds before the bell. I was about to enter the room when a late student walked through me, a boy that tasted of lime and sugar, enough sorrow stretching off him to suck on for a year, but his shoulders were straight, strong enough to carry the weight. I was curious enough to step closer. His sorrow was brittle, unlike the flowing liquid sorrow of Mrs. Bach. I breathed in his scent of honeysuckle, breaking off a corner of his sorrow and giving it a small nibble. The taste was strong, a spice that opened my sinuses and cleared my head. He paused in the doorway, looking back as if he sensed me. Very few ordinaries are sensitive enough to recognize when there is a demon close by, and even fewer ordinaries can tell when their sorrow has been consumed. I thought for just an instant that he was looking at me. Impossible. Then the moment passed, and he entered the classroom with an older woman. Mrs. Bach waved him over to an empty seat at the side of the room. "Welcome, class. I want to introduce you to Alejandro Garay and his interpreter. Alejandro has transferred to join our gymnastics team. From what I understand, you competed in nationals over the summer." The older woman interpreted Mrs. Bach's words, and Alejandro nodded. He spoke with his hands, the interpreter's voice resounding around the room. "Yes, thank you. I'm happy to be here." There was a subtle whispering, and then the class quieted and settled. I shifted onto the bookshelf next to the dusty dictionaries, my invisible, flexible essence conforming to the small space. I sighed, knowing this was the place I'd come closest to being able to experience human emotion, knowing that time was short to find a way to achieve my goal, to fill myself with emotion in a way no demon had before. Alejandro glanced back at my shelf, scowling as if he sensed something that didn't belong, something he couldn't explain. But it couldn't be me. I was a demon, invisible to the human eye, undetectable, unimportant, an empty shell of an essence, an incomplete parasite that had to feed off the sorrow of the living to keep from becoming a beast. He would have just been another boy with a delicious crust of sorrow, easy to ignore, until the interpreter formed Mrs. Bach's question with her hands and asked who had read Paradise Lost. Alejandro was the only student in the class to raise his hand, his eyes widening and his lips quirking up at the corners. Something shifted in my essence, almost like I felt something. Chapter 2. After class, I followed Alejandro for the rest of the day, seeing if the strange shift inside me would happen again. I had to find out if he was the key to bridging the gap between my emptiness and the ability to wield my own emotions. No demon had succeeded in changing their essence to become substantial enough to contain emotions and produce the threads that grew from the chest of ordinaries. Somehow my essence was pulled toward this boy like he was the one who could change me. I'd spent thousands of years reading languages of ordinaries and could recognize patterns and repetition and rhythm. I studied the way Alejandro and his interpreter communicated, sometimes getting the urge to hide behind a corner so he couldn't feel my intense gaze. But, other than the moment in the classroom when he seemed to look right at me, he showed no signs of sensing my presence. By the end of the day, my essence ached to have a conversation with him. I had a strange, pressing sensation that if he looked into my essence, if he spoke with me the same way he spoke with his interpreter, I would be able to share his emotions, experience them for myself. But to have a conversation with him, I would need to become visible. There was only one way for a demon to interact with the ordinaries on their level. I would have to possess a human body. I'd never possessed anyone over the thousands of years of my existence. Demon-possessed ordinaries had a scent of ammonia that burned my essence. Other demons took extreme measures to always have the shell of an ordinary available for possession, so they could experience the world with more influence. But from the stories of other demons, possession wouldn't make me capable of feeling emotions. It was just a suit that would restrict my movements and limit my ability to stay in the library after closing hours. The chance to have a conversation with Alejandro was worth the inconveniences. The final bell rang and the classrooms emptied. I followed the flow of conversation the way I tracked the meaning of a poem, letting the rhythm lead me, listening with my essence for the conversation I needed. A girl leaned against a wall, tears forming in her eyes as she studied the screen on her phone. No one is even looking at them, not a single like or comment. I would give anything for one viral video. If people could see what I'm doing, I know they would like it. Her friend patted her shoulder, the way I had imagined patting Mrs. Bach this morning. Maybe this next one. Don't give up. The girl pushed off the wall and went into the bathroom. I hesitated at the door, not because I couldn't walk through the door or squeeze my essence through the crack by the hinges, but because I needed to review my plan. I was going to offer this girl a deal, the way Cato Filius had taught me. Find something they desire more than anything in the world, and then dangle it in front of their noses. Make sure the contract is clear, binding, and signed. I'd seen the Father of Demons contracts. They were ironclad, small print, soul-claiming for eternity kind of documents. Not even a Hollywood lawyer could find a loophole in one of Cato Filius's contracts. That wasn't what I had in mind. Not with the end of the world plan coming to fruition. I didn't want to give up the freedom of my demon essence for the great battle. I didn't want to be trapped inside a human body until it was skewered on the battlefield. No, I just wanted a taste. An experiment, and if I failed, I'd decide how to join the demon forces before the end. I gathered my essence around me, making sure no other students were about to enter the bathroom, and pushed through the door. There were a few different strategies to approaching a human with a contract. I'd been taught to use fear. Fear was a red strand of emotion that snapped out of an ordinary like a broken rubber band. A red strand of fear often got twisted around the human soul, causing permanent anxiety, like the pressure of an elephant sitting on their chest. I'd seen ordinaries struggle to draw breath when nothing was wrong except the physical manifestation of their own emotions, squeezing them dry. I made the lights flicker, and the girl whirled away from the mirror, the red strand of fear growing more slowly than I expected. I checked her essence for an identity. Jackie Baxter. 17, raised by a traditional couple with 7 children. Jackie was 6th in the lineup and suffered from an inferiority complex. She wanted to be noticed and feel special. I cast a shadow on the wall, letting a single light flicker enough to make the shadow twist and writhe. Who's there? What do you want? Jackie's hands were shaking, but she held her phone up with both hands, wielding the camera like a weapon. Good. The next step was to play off their desires, offering them the riches of the world in exchange for their soul. It was all very cliché, but modern ordinaries' motivations hadn't evolved much over the evolution of the species. I made the words appear on her phone. Look in the mirror. Jackie turned back around, hands shaking, phone still held high. When she saw herself, she leaned forward and wiped the smeared mascara from beneath her eyes. I climbed onto her shoulder and twisted my essence through her hair, around her neck, and trickled into her ears. I adjusted the view she saw in the mirror. I showed her what she wanted to see. Likes, follows, comments, a viral video that would make her profile top the algorithm for weeks. Jackie's tears dried. Her hands stopped shaking. The strand of fear rolled itself back into her chest. What do you want? I whispered the terms of the contract into her mind, waited while she filmed her own reaction in the mirror. Show me again, Jackie said. I let her view rise to the frame again, showing her the parts that she craved the most, and then I made the contract appear on her phone. The terms were simple. I, Jackie Baxter, recipient, relinquish the use of my physical body to a demon essence for 3 days. In exchange, the recipient's next social media post will receive over 1 million views. Recipient will have no memory of the time of possession and will be responsible for all consequences, parking tickets, and missing assignments accrued over the time of possession. Recipient's signature. Jackie Baxter took a deep breath. She couldn't see me, only the contract on her phone and the vision of the future in the mirror. But her eyes shone with a ravenous hunger I recognized. The views and likes need to be from actual accounts. No bots, and I don't want the video to go viral until I can remember it, not while I'm possessed. Jackie took the whole thing with a lot more acceptance than I was expecting. A quick check on her phone explained a lot. Her social media accounts were about strange, unexplainable things that had happened in the world, exposing the worst in people and showing how the unbelievable could be believed. Most of the videos were doctored to exaggerate the possibilities. Jackie already believed in angels, demons, ghosts, and extraterrestrial life, and she didn't care how she made people look to prove she was right, and now her belief was giving her a chance at going viral. Oh, and I need my body back Thursday morning at dawn. Take it or leave it. I must have missed some of the lessons on demon possession. The others had always made it feel more one-sided, like the demon got all the benefits and the contract was full of tricks and small print that left the soul chained to the demon for eternity. But that wasn't how this interaction was going. This girl had a future as a defense attorney or a patent clerk. She knew how to keep her cool and read between the lines. I shifted my essence and rewrote the contract in front of Jackie's eyes. I included the guarantee of no bot accounts and the date of the viral video not to occur until the possession was complete. I hesitated before I changed the date. Thursday morning at dawn. Today was Tuesday, 3:15 p.m., a little under 40 hours to try and figure out my connection to Alejandro and change myself enough to contain emotion. I would be missed at the gathering by then for sure, but at least I would have my chance before the end. Jackie stood there with her phone up, her head tilted to the side. She wasn't about to budge on her requests. I updated the contract to include possession to last 40 hours, or until dawn on September 4th. She lifted her finger with only a slight tremor, the fear thread back, thin and weak. She raised one eyebrow at herself in the mirror. That's it? An e-signature? No blood? No magic Professor Umbridge quill? I didn't answer. Not only because I would sound like crackling static and howling winds, but because Jackie was already tracing her finger along the screen. Contracts hadn't been signed in blood since the price of ink dropped in 1157 AD, but rumors persisted. Now there was no need to even use ink. No one could beat an online signature. It was less messy, easy to file, and binding across all planes of existence. As soon as Jackie hit accept, she dropped her phone in the dry sink and leaned on the edges for support. I felt the sucking sensation grab my essence and pull me into Jackie's body through her eardrums. The sound of my essence grating across the vestibular nerve wasn't unlike the sound of someone learning to play the violin. Then I was standing, feet firm against the floor, palms pressed against the sink, eyes glued to the face in the mirror. Not my own face, but the face of Jackie Baxter, soon to be overnight viral sensation, but only after I had my conversation with Alejandro. Chapter 3. The school had cleared out by the time I found my new balance on Jackie's legs. Alejandro was gone, and I wouldn't see him until tomorrow morning. It was possible to do stalking in this form, but easier to get caught now that people could see me. The last thing that would get me close enough to Alejandro was to make the wrong first impression. Stalking seemed to have that negative vibe in the culture of ordinaries. I used my time between 3:15 p.m. on Tuesday and 7:15 a.m. on Wednesday to prepare to blend in, and that brought me to my favorite place, the library. I spent the open hours of the library studying sign language and training my hands to create the words I wanted to use to communicate. It's a good thing I have a demon mind and several thousand years' experience. Learning a language is difficult. I hid in the bathroom as the library closed, and then I couldn't help myself. I curled up on a chair in the back corner of the library, and I read poetry. I picked up dusty books, fingered the spines, opened the cover, and turned the pages. I checked Jackie's purse, but the girl didn't carry a library card. Maybe she deserved to be possessed for the rest of eternity. In the early morning hours, I spent more time in the bathroom, practicing the language in front of the mirror. Something felt wrong. I hadn't figured out what it was by the time I headed to school. I stepped in front of Alejandro as he was about to enter Mrs. Bach's class. I'd had to sneak a poetry book out of the library to start the conversation since I couldn't check out one. Alejandro bumped into me as planned, but his reflexes were quicker than I expected. He reached out, grabbed me by the elbow, keeping me from stumbling back, and catching the library book before it hit the floor. I confess, I may have let out an undemon-like squeak when he pulled me close against him. I was still getting used to the vocal cords. I stepped back. The hand he kept on the small of my back was large and strong. He supported me until I regained my balance, and then let go. Several kids laughed as they pushed into the classroom, but Alejandro held my gaze. His eyes were locked onto mine. He lifted his hand and brushed his fingers across the palm of his other hand twice. The interpreter opened her mouth, but I had prepared for this moment. "Excuse me," I signed. "My fault. I'll watch where I'm going next time." Alejandro's eyebrows came together, leaving a single wrinkle above his nose. I've studied human facial expressions for several hundred years, but it was a very different experience to have them directed at me, to be the source of his confusion, a victory. Not only did I identify his emotions, but I was the cause of it. He glanced at the title of my collection of poems. The collection included Paradise Lost to start a conversation with him, but he chose a different poem. "I like Coleridge. I've read Kubla Khan 100 times." Alejandro signed with quick motions. "Me too. I did love that poem." But a line from the poem pushed its way into my memory. A woman wailing for her demon lover. He couldn't possibly know about me. It had to be a coincidence. It reminds me of my own dreams sometimes. "Are you okay?" Alejandro asked instead of responding to my comment. Each time I signed, he stared at my face, the furrow of confusion deepening. I nodded, though my insides had not changed. My only sensation was demon hunger, a deep void of nothingness. I wanted to fill it with human emotions, if only I could figure out how. "I'm fine. We didn't hit that hard," I said. Alejandro raised one eyebrow, his scalp lifting, one ear pulling back, his lips pressed together, thinning to a line. This emotion was harder. Was it anger? Insanity? No. I recognized it after a moment. Disbelief. He didn't believe me. Alejandro waved a hand to indicate my face. "What's wrong?" I touched my eyebrows and then my cheeks and mouth. "Something's wrong with my face?" As soon as I said it, I realized what had been wrong with my practice in the mirror. The muscles in Jackie's face that react to emotions didn't work while I was in her body. No emotions, no facial movement. "I don't know," I lied. "I'm a demon after all." Alejandro reached forward and used his thumb to lift one of my eyebrows. I registered the pressure against my skin, the warmth of his hand. He used both hands to pull at my cheeks, stretching my lips tight the way his had a moment before. My essence shifted, a movement inside that was neither hunger nor emptiness. He pulled away, and I tried to make my face respond. I willed my demon essence to twitch the muscle below the small patch of hair above my eye. Nothing. I used my own hands to pull my lips back into a smile. Based on Alejandro's grimace, I had not conveyed joy. He shook his head and made a dismissive gesture. "Go to class. I have something I have to do." "Wait. I want to talk more." I needed more time, but his discomfort was obvious. He stepped back. "You talk with your hands, make the right movements, but it's difficult to understand what you mean when your face doesn't move, your body doesn't match what you're saying. To communicate, your hands, face, and body all work together." The ammonia smell had faded, or I'd grown used to it, but my comfort in this body hadn't extended to the nerves on my face. I hadn't considered the fact that my possession would make him uncomfortable, that my effort to get close to him would backfire. Alejandro turned away from me, not toward the classroom, but facing the emptied hall. The tardy bell had already rung. I could step into the classroom, but what was the point? He was my hope. Even now, something about him made me sure he was the person who could help me change enough to be able to feel. I reached out, clinging to the fabric of his sleeve, not sure what to do. I'd lived like this for thousands of years. The hunger inside me was painful enough to make me wrap my arms around myself. I would have to fight in the final battle, empty and hungry. The emptiness seemed to freeze the air around me. Alejandro moved like he was about to pull away, but then he paused and closed his eyes, like he was listening to something far away. His face showed regret and indecision, but he didn't shake me off. I could see a strand of his emotion stretched tight as it grew from his chest, reaching out toward me. It was a deep golden color, glowing in the incandescent lights of the hallway. Instinct, the emotion that humans often call a gut feeling, but Alejandro's was different. Powerful. Alejandro stiffened as someone approached us. My essence shriveled, trying to hide while I stood completely exposed in the hallway. There, right in front of me, in the middle of Olympus High School, was a descendant of angels, glowing bright with the energy of creation, dressed in bell-bottoms and a tweed jacket, a green whip attached to his corduroy pants. The descendant had made a terrible attempt to blend in with the fashion of today, although based on the trends I'd witnessed over the last 7 decades, the descendant would be back in style in about 4 years. Before I could slink away, the descendant reached out and shook Alejandro's hand. Then he sniffed like he was trying to identify an indistinct smell. He was slow in that department. I definitely didn't smell like chocolate chip cookies fresh out of the oven. The descendant looked at Alejandro. "Is this girl bothering you?" Chapter 4. I realized I was still clinging to Alejandro's shirt. I made my fingers release the fabric and kept my eyes glued to the tiled floor. Retreat was the best option, but before I could slip into Mrs. Bach's classroom to escape, Alejandro's golden instinct thread reached out and wrapped around my wrist, preventing me from going anywhere. Neither Alejandro nor the descendant could see emotion like a demon can, so neither of them reacted to the chain around my wrist. "No, I want her here with me." The interpreter said the words as Alejandro signed them, but a change had come over her. Her eyes had glazed over, and her face had gone slack. A trick of the descendants when they interacted with ordinaries they didn't want to remember them. The interpreter would have no recollection of this conversation. I tried to pull my hand free of the golden strand of emotion, but it was difficult to do without drawing attention to myself, and the last thing I wanted was to steal the descendants' attention away from Alejandro. "You've notified us that you're ready to move on to the testing phase. Is that correct?" Testing? I looked between the descendant and Alejandro, and I realized what I was witnessing. Cadophilius wasn't the only one gathering recruits for the final days. Alejandro was being recruited to be a guardian. The descendants of angels were preparing for the end of time, and they had chosen Alejandro to join their legions. Apparently, they had tests. The demon horde wasn't so picky. If you had a demon essence and a first name, you were required to join when called, a call I had ignored. "I'd like to see what I can do." Alejandro moved his hands with firm, decisive movements. "I want to make a difference." I didn't know what would happen if the descendant noticed that I had possessed Jackie, but from the slack expression on the interpreter's face, my lack of facial movement would only make the descendant think I was an ordinary, and that I would forget this interaction as soon as it was over. I risked a glance at Alejandro. His eyes were alight with determination, a desire I felt reflected in my hungry soul. I felt pulled toward his energy like a stream of water is pulled toward a balloon full of static. The golden strand slipped off my wrist like it sensed my decision to stay put. "There will be 3 tests. The descendant spoke like a presenter reading off a slide presentation, and I thought I lacked emotion. "Our 3 priorities are to protect, serve, and uplift. You will be tested on each of these qualities. If you pass, you will be invited to join us at the Veil and trained to become a guardian." "What happens if I fail?" Alejandro asked. The interpreter made the words monotone, with no inflection, no concern or interest drawn in her features. I could see the tension in Alejandro as his emotions swirled around him. "If you survive, but fail to reach our standard of acceptance, you will not be able to return to your normal life. Your memories will be erased, and you'll be given a new identity. You will not remember any of this." What were the odds? I had less than 24 hours left in this ordinary's body, and my one chance to speak with the boy who appreciated poetry and expressed emotions was being interrupted by my declared enemy. Descendants and their guardians scattered demon essences to try and bring peace to the world, while we eked out an existence sucking on sorrow. As if that wasn't bad enough, now they were willing to risk this boy's life and memory to find more warriors for the end of time. "When do I start?" Alejandro formed the question, and the interpreter repeated it. The descendant disappeared before the reply echoed through the air. Now. The classroom doors slammed shut. The lights shifted from a bright yellow to a dull red. A thick fog rose from the floor, and a flashing white light from the emergency fire system pulsed through the halls. The interpreter was gone. I stepped in front of Alejandro to sign the words where he could see me. Don't do this. He looked at me, examining my motionless face, holding my gaze captive the way the string of emotion had held my wrist. If he was looking for something in my expression that would convince him to listen to me, he didn't find it. The hallway was deserted except for me and Alejandro. I waved my hand through the fog, studying the movement that my physical form could create, while my mind reviewed what had just happened. The descendant had pulled Alejandro and I into a paused, alternate state to take some kind of test. The descendant's first priority was to protect, so even though the descendant had seemed annoyed at my presence, he needed me, needed someone for Alejandro to protect. They'd brought me along, thinking I was an ordinary, to see if Alejandro would succeed in protecting me. Protecting me from what? Not that I needed protecting. When a demon possessed an ordinary, they had otherworldly power, speed, and endurance. There wasn't a fight I couldn't win. The question was, did I fight, or did I sabotage a potential enemy soldier? If he failed, he would be taken away and I wouldn't get my conversation. If he won, he would join the Veil, but at least I would have more time. The longer the tests lasted, the more time I would have with him. I wouldn't let him fail, not until the very last moment. Out of the fog came a large shadow of a beast, a creature that was as familiar to me as my own essence, the creature that demons become when they are starved of sorrow too long. A Fenris. Stay back, Alejandro signed. Did they give you any weapons? I asked. A descendant could scatter the essence of a Fenris for a short time with a weapon lined with green hematite, but even a descendant couldn't hold off a Fenris with their bare hands. Alejandro stepped between me and the beast. He was right about body movements being its own aspect of the language. He didn't have to sign a word to tell me he was willing to protect me from danger. He didn't even know me. He was brave, but this wasn't right. There was more to the test. I pulled on Alejandro's shoulder and turned him toward me. Look around. They must have left you a way to fight. They want to know if you can see more than just the enemy. I don't know if I'd read those words in a poem or somewhere back in my demon training, but the words rang true in my essence. The message had its intended effect. Alejandro went on the defensive and studied his surroundings. When the beast lunged, Alejandro dodged to the right, pulling me to the floor, so the Fenris flew over our heads, missing its target and sliding down the hall on its poison-tipped claws. There, I pointed, but Alejandro was already moving. He'd seen it first. One of the lockers had a green light coming out of the vent. Alejandro punched the locker to bend it out of place. He grabbed the top corner and jerked outward. His strength was impressive, but there had to be more, a reason the descendants were looking to recruit him. The locker resisted a moment too long. The beast recovered its footing and launched itself at Alejandro before he could pull out the weapon. I tackled the beast, wrapping my arms around its neck and twisting so that the Fenris's feet slipped out from under it. We slid into the wall, crashing against a door. With my arms wrapped around the neck of one of my siblings, I understood its hunger like it was my own, a feral, consuming emptiness that cried out to be fed. I ran my hand down the slimy back of the Fenris, whispered calming lines into its ear from the poem The Fish by Elizabeth Bishop. I spoke of victory and rainbows. Metal squealed as Alejandro succeeded in ripping the locker door open and pulling the weapon free. I didn't see what weapon he held, but I felt my sibling fighting to break loose of my grip, legs flailing, jaw snapping. I repeated the last line of the poem, and I let the fish go. I released the Fenris. It clawed its way to its feet, turning on me, teeth bared, leaning forward, nose to nose. There was a flash of green as Alejandro brought his weapon down. The Fenris let out a shrill whine of pain, of relief, and then disintegrated into ashes. Chapter 5. The lights in the hall returned to normal, but the yellow felt sickly and weak. Several classroom doors opened, and Mrs. Bach's voice floated into the hall. Alejandro held a short blade that retracted into the handle before he slipped it into the pocket of his jacket. Alejandro's interpreter stood by the door, blinking rapidly, like she'd got a piece of disintegrated Fenris caught in her eye. "Time to go in," the interpreter signed to Alejandro, motioning toward the door. Alejandro shook his head and turned away, fists clenched with determination. He'd passed his first test and wasn't giving up. I ran a toe through the dust of my sibling on the floor. The descendants hadn't given Alejandro a fair chance. Things would have turned out differently if I hadn't intervened. Was he willing to die to pass a stupid test? If I stopped Alejandro from becoming a guardian, his memory would be erased, and I would lose the chance to study his emotions. But if I helped him through the tests, I would be technically betraying my own kind. I'd already chose this path when I ignored the call, but helping the descendants train a guardian to keep demons from getting the sustenance they needed was a deeper betrayal. Still, this was my last chance to have a moment where my essence could be filled with the emotions of ordinaries. My hunger rumbled, shaking me from the inside. It was a hunger I needed to fill. But I was no longer just interacting with an ordinary. I was in the sights of the descendants themselves. If I was caught, I would be thrown in the prison of the possessed, my essence scattered when Jackie died. They'd never believe a demon only signed a possession contract for 3 days. It had never happened before. Following Alejandro meant stepping into the unknown, choosing a road with a different destination, a road less traveled by. It was the line from another of my favorite poems that made me move my feet. I didn't understand everything that was happening, or why the descendants had chosen Alejandro, but I ran after him, following him toward the doors of the school. I touched his shoulder as he was about to exit the building. His eyebrows shot up in surprise when he saw me. "I want to help you." I pulled back to sign the words, conscious of the way he'd glance at my hand resting on his shoulder. "I thought you'd forget what happened," Alejandro said. Jackie would have forgotten if she'd been a normal ordinary, free from the possession of a demon essence, but I remembered the feel of my sibling in my arms. I'd fought every day of my demon existence to avoid becoming a Fenris, but that had meant sucking on the sorrow of people like Mrs. Buck and Alejandro, feeding off their darkness, sometimes even creating it. "I remember." I pointed to my temple and nodded. "And I want to help." "How can you help?" Alejandro pushed through the doors, holding one open for me as I followed him out. "What's the next test?" I asked. "To serve." "Easy. I know a soup kitchen downtown. You can literally serve soup for a couple of hours." I've never served the soup, but the kitchen was close to the library, and wasn't a bad place to find some abandoned strands of sorrow. Alejandro shook his head. He turned toward me as he signed the words, making sure I could see his emotions. The muscles in his face danced with expression, acting out a complicated play. Descendants protect, serve, and uplift without disrupting ordinary lives. I must do the tests without letting anyone know I'm doing it. I can take no thanks, receive no gratitude or reward, or I fail the next 2 tests. Why would you do anything that doesn't benefit yourself? The idea baffled me. After an existence spent trying to satisfy my own hunger, that's not the way of the descendants of angels. Their purpose is to bring light without exposing the source. That is what creates hope. And hope is light. I meant to sign the words the way a young ordinary repeats their parents' rules, full of sarcasm, but I couldn't roll my eyes the way I'd seen other ordinaries do. Alejandro looked at me with one eyebrow quirked. "I don't understand why your face doesn't move," Alejandro said. "I'm confused by what you mean." "You'll have to deal with my face if you want help. I know where we could go to serve without getting caught." I had never considered using my demon abilities to help someone, but if I wanted to change in a new way, I had to follow new paths. Alejandro drove, and I directed him downtown to an older brick building with construction barrels blocking the entrance to the parking lot and a garbage chute dangling from an upper-floor window. I generally avoided eating construction workers' sorrow. The sorrow often had a gritty texture with an oily aftertaste. Too many construction workers were tied to the belief that if they worked hard enough, things would eventually go their way. Many of them worked themselves to death on that hope. If the goal was to serve without getting caught, this was the right place. A lot of people doing different tasks focused on getting through the day. We'd blend right in. We started with piles of garbage, grabbing heavy bags that had been left for an evening cleanup, or items too large to fit down the garbage chute. We walked the long way through the building, sometimes taking the stairs instead of the elevator, always doing whatever it took to avoid being noticed. When Alejandro would turn away, I would stop and take time to move my eyebrows, scrunch my lips, or puff out my cheeks. The muscles barely responded. My large motor skills improved with every load of trash we took out of the building, but I could not access the small muscles of my face. A group of construction workers waited for some concrete to harden. The air was cool and the concrete was drying slowly. I don't know what kind of people have the patience to wait around for stone to harden. I heated the air around the concrete and saved the construction workers 3 hours of waiting. Alejandro proved observant as well. He tightened the connection on a loose safety harness, keeping a man from falling from some scaffolding. He corrected the placement of some straps right before the crane lifted a heavy load into the air. He saved the whole load and possibly the life of the man directing the crane. "How did you know to do that?" I asked. "Have you worked in construction before?" He shrugged, turning away from me instead of answering, cutting off any other questions. By the end of the day, I could see the small changes we had made. The strands of emotions shifted and swirled in each man, colors brighter and stronger than at the beginning of the day. Some of the workers would find their work done and turn and help another. We were cleaning a final pile of debris when the foreman walked in, doing a walkthrough with a man in a clean, expensive suit. The man in the suit shook hands with the foreman. "We are more than pleased with the improvement today." The foreman's chest glowed with a pink strand of pride. Then he turned and laid eyes on us. I pushed a gust of wind through the window openings, scattering dust into the air and making both the foreman and the owner turn and cover their eyes. Alejandro and I ran around the corner and climbed out the window onto the scaffolding. We matched each other as we climbed down, hand over hand, dropping the last 10 feet to the pavement. The foreman called out the window for someone to stop us, but we were already around the building and out on the street. We slipped into the second open business, a small cafe, and sat at a table. Alejandro laughed as 2 construction workers in hard hats ran by, looking for the intruders on the construction site, never guessing they were looking for a demon and a future guardian. Alejandro's chest grew an emerald strand of emotion, happiness. My essence shifted again, almost like I wasn't empty anymore. Still, I could not get my lips to form the slightest smile. It was nice not to feel empty and hungry, but it wasn't the same as feeling something. "Do you think that was enough to pass the test?" Alejandro asked. "I don't know. Maybe you were able to do some good without getting caught. And even more than that, Alejandro had done some things that looked closer to a miracle. How did you know about the other things? The things that saved people's lives today?" Alejandro looked away. I knew the lack of movement in my face still bothered him. All my efforts through the day had failed to make a single facial muscle twitch, but this wasn't about me. Even demons who keep secrets don't like secrets being kept from them. "How did you know to do those things?" Finally he looked at me. He formed the words slowly, hesitantly. "I have a sense when bad things are about to happen. I get impulses or feelings of what I should do to stop those things from happening. I don't always know why or what changed, but I have something in me that is always guiding me, telling me to do things that I wouldn't normally do, and I've learned to never ignore it." I sat back against my seat as the waiter brought us both a glass of water. I'd seen what Alejandro was talking about, the golden thread from this morning that wrapped around my wrist, a fate thread. That explained the interest of the descendants. Even though Alejandro was strong and quick and observant, those qualities weren't unique, and there were probably millions of other ordinaries who could do the same things. The descendants knew that Alejandro influenced the future, and they wanted him on their team, or they wanted him out of the picture. That's why the first test had been so unfair. If he passed, that meant his fate thread was real. If he failed, he was out of the picture, no longer an uncontrolled variable. The descendants sleep better either way. "That's why you're letting me help. You knew I was important." Alejandro shrugged again. "I had an impulse that I needed you around, that you were an important piece." My essence emptied out, the hunger returning full force. An important piece? I didn't know what that meant. Had a demon ever been touched by a fate thread? Or was Jackie supposed to be the one to help Alejandro, and I screwed up his internal compass? I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I satiated my hunger with the sorrow of a woman crying in the stall. I studied my face in the mirror while I sucked on the strand of sorrow caused by an unexpected breakup that was long enough to wrap around the bathroom twice. I touched my face the way Alejandro had this morning. One eyebrow up, two eyebrows up, wrinkles forming on my forehead, lips spread wide, lips pursed thin, a weird version of face yoga that left my face tingling but still beyond control. After studying Alejandro's facial expressions all day, I could see how much I lacked. I could not get the facial muscles to move, no expressions, a wax model of the body I possessed. If I could move my face, maybe I could force myself to feel emotions, but there was nothing. When I approached Alejandro, he stood. His eyebrows were pulled down, his lips tight, his eyes lowered. It was not a good emotion. Through the glass window of the cafe, I saw the descendant recruiter walking away, hat pulled down low to avoid attention. Before I could ask what he had wanted, Alejandro lifted his hand and directed his words toward my heart. I know who you are. Chapter 6. I looked down at myself, expecting my demon essence to be completely exposed, but Alejandro was studying my face as if my identity was all that mattered in the world. You're Jackie Baxter. So that was what the descendant had come here to show him. He wanted to expose who Alejandro was working with, to try and get Alejandro to do the last task on his own. You fake explained events to try and get more views. As bad as that sounded, being a soul possessed by a demon was probably worse. He didn't know who I really was, and that probably meant the descendant didn't know either. I was safe to continue my search for emotions for the next 12 hours. But I had to convince Alejandro I was worth taking along. The fate thread no longer reached out toward me, so maybe I was only needed to pass the first test. I didn't know you knew me, I said. I had to decide how to play this. I could act remorseful or embarrassed. Somehow, neither of those reactions seemed like they would satisfy Alejandro. Yes, Alejandro's posture was stiff, his body angled away from me. I know who you are and what kind of person you are. Now I know why you didn't believe I would do something without a personal reward. I put up my hand before Alejandro could form his next sentence. You might not like what I do or what my life goals are, but everyone wants something different. Don't judge me for my dreams, and I won't judge you for yours. My essence flared with the heat at my lie. I was judging him for his dreams. I had assumed he wanted glory, the attention that came with being a hero, but the afternoon had proved me wrong. He'd been willing to protect me at the risk of his own life, knowing his success would bring no attention. No one would know. He had served those construction workers without a single reward, and being a descendant was only more work with no recognition. People didn't know they existed. What motivated Alejandro to pass the tests to become a guardian? I'm not judging you. His movements were softer, almost like he was admitting a mistake in the motion of his hands. You shouldn't benefit off the mistakes of others or deceive people with fake videos. That's wrong. If only he knew. I feed off the mistakes of others, survive off them. Alejandro pointed at my face. Your eyebrow moved. I slapped my forehead like I was swatting an annoying mosquito. My essence felt like it was being pumped full of air. Had I felt something? I checked my chest for strands of emotion. Nothing. But somehow I had access to facial muscle. Was it surprise? Humor? Irony? It must have been irony. Alejandro had been angry at Jackie for benefiting off the mistakes of others, without realizing he was talking to a demon who literally survived by making sure ordinaries felt every mistake for as long as possible. Prolonged sorrow fermented and was bubbly on the tongue, leaving demons lightheaded after feeding. Let me try again, I said. We were both distracted from Alejandro's anger as we focused on my face with the attention of scientists looking for unidentified species. I stared at him, losing myself in his brown eyes, so full of emotion, a rainstorm of frustration, rising self-doubt, silhouetted by a hope shining bright from somewhere deep inside. I focused on what I could sense of my face. I moved my essence into Jackie's head, filling the space until even the tips of her ears had some of my essence stuffed inside. Then I thought of the poems I'd read, the shifting of my essence when Alejandro had first noticed me, the lightness I felt right now with his eyes focused on me. I tried to smile. "Anything?" I asked. His face had gotten so close to mine, I had to bring my hands up between our noses to ask the question. The muscles on Alejandro's face relaxed, eyebrows lowering, lips spreading out. Disappointment. His eyes dropped away. He shook his head. My essence squirmed out of my head and spread out through the rest of the body. I'd been pretty sure I'd at least made the ear wiggle, but that wasn't emotion. That was moving a muscle, not feeling. I was still cold and empty like every other demon, starving for life. "It's getting dark." I motioned to the horizon where the sun had set several minutes ago, the edges of the buildings glowing gold with the last rays of light. "There's one test left," Alejandro said. I nodded. "Uplift." Even signing the words made my essence shiver. Demons didn't make people feel better. That was literally like a farmer poisoning his crops, so he didn't have any food for the winter. Demons magnified the sorrow of ordinaries, made sure that they heard messages that deepened their mood and made the meal last longer. It was why descendants were our enemies. The descendants of angels wanted to bring hope and light to the world, but then what would my siblings and I survive on? Without sorrow, all demons would turn into Fenris and destroy life in a feeding frenzy. It wasn't a pretty balance, but the world needed to keep demons fed, or it would mean the end of life. It was a conundrum. If the descendants ever did achieve world peace, it would literally bring on the apocalypse. Now both sides were preparing for that scenario. Like both demons and descendants were sick of balancing the scales and were ready to tip them one way or the other, for good or for bad. The streets were still busy with couples going to dinner, friends talking and laughing, dressed for a night out, a family on vacation hustling back to their hotels to get their kids to bed for the night. Alejandro looked around. His fate thread was limp, offering no guidance for his next decision. Even through my eyes, there wasn't a lot of sorrow to feed on. I could keep him here and make sure he failed his final test, but I wanted to see more of his emotion. I still had time to sabotage the last test. My contract ended at dawn. Demons had been feeding off sorrow since the beginning of time, and if the preparations for the end were as big as I suspected, one more guardian wouldn't destroy the balance. I found that my essence felt thicker when I thought about the look on Alejandro's face when he passed the tests. I confess, I wanted to see a guardian succeed. Was that a feeling? To want? I saw no emotion strand coming from me, and my hunger was still there, but maybe I was less empty than before. Strange that wanting something for someone other than myself filled me with more of me. It would be a shame when I had to make him fail. I touched Alejandro's arm to get his attention and felt my essence react, a shiver that left me hungry for more. "I know where to go for your final test." I motioned for him to follow. He hesitated. "Why are you helping me? Is it only so you can get another post for social media?" That might have been true for Jackie, but I wasn't Jackie. No, honesty was easy sometimes. I want to help. I want to feel good. I wanted to feel something, anything, but I didn't say it. I led Alejandro to the back alleys near the train track, the dark feeding ground of demons on the verge of shifting into Fenris. Ordinaries and demon essences lay about in temporary shacks and tents of the desperate and homeless. Ordinaries who had been cast out of society, left to beg for food and sleep on the sidewalks. Their sorrow was hard to digest with the unfairness that crusted the edges, but it was a constant source of food, and the demons lay draped over the tents or lounging on the shopping carts, sucking on strands that had grown overripe, long and stringy, from the ordinaries curled up on the ground or standing next to barrel fires. "How did you know this would be here?" Alejandro asked. I didn't have a good answer other than every demon can smell where community sorrow collects. I couldn't tell him that. Every human civilization throughout time has had collections of the desperate and depressed, the lonely and hopeless. I had spent too much time among the leper colonies in Rome when I'd been on the verge of lapsing into Fenris form. I'd sworn never to get that low again. "What are you going to do for your final act?" I asked. "How will you uplift for test number 3? Chapter 7. Alejandro didn't seem fazed as he looked around the camp. I've seen ordinaries with good intentions come with blankets and food, hesitant, awkward, feeling generous, but aloof. Alejandro didn't have that hesitation. He made eye contact with a man wearing fingerless gloves, a beanie, and 2 jackets. It was early fall, but not cold enough for 2 winter jackets. He held the coats tight around him like they were all he possessed in the world. "Will you interpret for me?" Alejandro asked me. I hadn't expected to have an assignment for this final test. I had only been hoping to feel the shifting in me grow, come a little closer to my goal before my time ran out. But I found myself stepping closer, studying the man's face as much as Alejandro's. Alejandro held out his hand, and the man accepted the handshake. His widening eyes and partly open mouth showed surprise and pleasure. I wondered how long it had been since someone had spoken directly to the ordinary and made eye contact. "May we sit?" I interpreted the words as Alejandro signed. I tried to raise my eyebrows to relay a question, but I didn't feel anything, maybe a slight twitch in my forehead. The man nodded. The demon that had been lounging nearby, whispering reminders of loss and forgotten dreams, raised his essence, examining Alejandro. Not many things interrupted sorrow-sucking demons of the homeless. The most desperate of my siblings didn't appreciate an interruption in their easy meal. I sat next to Alejandro, watching his hands as he communicated. Interpreting his motions into words gave me new insight into the importance of his facial and body movements. It did influence the meaning of the words, the emotion behind his meaning reflected on his face. We asked the man questions about himself. His name, what he liked to do, his favorite meal. His name was Michael. He'd been on the streets for 3 years after he tried to start a business that failed and lost not only his savings, but his wife and family. Alejandro watched me as I repeated the man's story, sharing the sorrow, absorbing Michael's emotions until they seemed to become his own. Maybe I had been so focused on developing my own emotions, I hadn't thought to reflect the emotions around me. Alejandro told Michael his own story of learning gymnastics in a world full of sound he couldn't hear, his desire to prove himself. The conversation continued, both Michael and Alejandro sharing stories with emotions that grew out of the very center of their souls. I tried to access my facial muscles again, a flare of my nostrils, a squeezing of my eyes, pain, sorrow, pride, determination, fear. How could these ordinaries contain so much emotion without bursting? I could tell when my interpretations didn't have enough emotion behind them. Alejandro's eyebrows would draw together, and he would study Michael's face to try and figure out the part I lacked. I saw how much power there was in both their expression and body language, so much communicated with so little effort. It was poetry in a different language. My emptiness, my hunger, grew inside me, desperate for what I couldn't have. In the moment, I could almost believe I was changing. Throughout the night, 3 others joined our group, talking, sharing thoughts. An older woman who had turned to substance abuse to hide from the pain of losing a child in a car accident, a young teen who had run away from an abusive home, a refugee with PTSD that couldn't find comfort indoors. Each had their own demon sucking on their sorrow. Each found comfort in Alejandro's attention, in the way he looked at them with respect and learned their names. I knew time was getting short. Dawn was approaching. I hadn't been able to understand human emotions, hadn't been able to fill my soul with them, but I'd discovered they were more complicated than an unsolvable physics equation, more central to the human experience than their physical bodies. Emotions weren't something I could put in a petri dish and study. They weren't even something that could be captured in a single poem. The world needed millions of poems to explore the nuances of emotions humans felt. I wasn't ready for this to end. I wasn't ready to stop learning, but my contract was almost up, and I would be missed at the gathering. I would be expected to play my role in the final battle. Your mouth turned down. Alejandro pointed at my face, his eyebrows shooting up. He straightened his shoulders. Are you feeling sad? I touched my face and concentrated. This time I managed a flare of the nostrils. Had the movement reflected an emotion grown inside of me, or had I only learned to control the smaller muscles? Maybe that would have to be enough. I could feel the morning approaching, hear the buzzing in Jackie's ears that warned the contract was almost up. I would become a demon essence once more. Empty, hungry, invisible. But at least I'd had this chance to feel the touch of Alejandro's emotions. I was so focused on controlling my facial muscles that I almost forgot about the other demons lying around. The constant flow of sorrow had slowed. The four ordinaries without home or kin were no longer sorrowing, but had grown purple and yellow and green strands of emotions from their chests. A single night of conversation changed their emotions, giving them hope, uplifting, staunching their flow of sorrow, and depriving my siblings of their regular meal. The demons who were on the verge of changing to Fenris had their last few ounces of sustenance cut off as their source of sorrow was replaced by a sense of satisfaction. It was almost too late when I noticed that Michael, the failed business owner, had a demon near him that was making the change. The demon's essence bubbled, jerked, twisted, blackened, and grew into a solid form. The back haunches were large, the front legs small. The beast had a round head, oversized, with a mouth full of jagged, poison-tipped teeth. Other demons started to change as well. Alejandro had uplifted 4 people enough that their demons had given in to the hunger. In the school, Alejandro had faced 1 Fenris. Now there were 4. It would be okay. Alejandro had a fate thread that would tell him what to do, how to escape the situation so that he had a future. But when I looked for his golden strand, there was no sign of it. Alejandro stood, placing himself between the Fenris and the group they'd been sitting with. Michael and the others stood with him, staring at the beasts that were now visible to everyone. You need to run, I said. Alejandro shook his head. The beasts rolled on the ground, scratching the itches of their newly formed shapes. People around them screamed, grabbing bedrolls, tents, bikes, shopping carts, whatever they could carry, scattering away from the 4 beasts. I lied to you. His thread of sorrow was thick and heavy. What do you mean? I wanted to push him away, make him run like the others, but this was his test. Our 4 new friends hadn't run either. They stood close behind us, picking up anything that could be used as a weapon, a piece of board, an old pipe, a discarded fork. What were these people thinking? There was no reward for them, no reason to fight to protect a stranger. Alejandro turned his full attention on me. We only had a few minutes before the Fenris grew comfortable enough with their forms to attack. I said I only wanted to make this world a better place, that I wasn't doing this for me. I know, I said. I've seen you do incredible things for other people. You've taken no reward. It's not true. I've been doing this. I accepted the tests because I wanted to prove to myself. No, I wanted to prove to everyone that I was good enough, that I was worthy. But spending time with you has made me feel different. I don't have to become a guardian to be worthy of anything. Now I know I already am. I always was. That doesn't matter now. I glanced at the Fenris as the first one rolled to its feet, sniffing and stretching and shaking its head back and forth. Right now you need to protect yourself. You need to get out of here. You've got your phone? Alejandro asked. Yeah, why? You're about to get a video no one will believe. But it will be real. He smiled at me. You can't do something nice for me. I don't deserve it. Everyone deserves kindness. No, I lied to you too. I'm not who you think I am. I'm the enemy. I'm a demon in a girl's skin, and I've been using you to get what I want. I'm planning to sabotage your tests and make you fail. The buzzing in my ears increased, the end of the contract growing nearer. Alejandro paused, studying me with his head tilted to one side. I saw the moment he accepted the truth, that I wasn't an ordinary, and it explained everything. Then he nodded. I would be okay. For the first time in my life, I would be okay if I failed. But you're still willing to die trying? I realized that seeing this ordinary find purpose and shake off his sorrow was more important than my experiment, than finding a way to feel emotions, more important than seeing him fail. I wanted him to succeed. The horizon was getting lighter. I could make out the features on Alejandro's face. There was no anger, and the fate thread was back. He reached out and touched my face, soft, barely a brush against my skin, not the pressure it took to force my face to move. I can see how you feel. It's written all over your face, and it's beautiful on you. I don't think you're a demon anymore. Get the others out of here, and I will hold them off until help comes. What if no one comes? I thought of my suspicions that the descendants were more worried about Alejandro's abilities than saving his life. A complication swept under the rug. The second Fenris rose to its feet, turning to stare at Alejandro. I will still protect them, to the very end. He pulled the weapon out of his pocket, the blade shooting out, long and sharp. He was ready. 1 against 4. Hopeless odds. Get the others out of here, please. I felt a tickle at the corner of my eye. I reached up to touch my face. Tears. Was this sorrow? It hurt worse than the hunger, worse than 1,000 days of emptiness and pain. I looked down and saw strands of color coiling out of my chest. Emotions, my very own. I looked back at Alejandro, met his eyes, knew there was only seconds before my essence was ejected, only moments before the Fenris attacked, before the 4 friends who had witnessed so much sorrow were overwhelmed by the Fenris. With all of that, I felt feelings. It was all I had ever wanted, and all I was about to lose. I grabbed Alejandro's face and brought it close to mine. Thank you. You're the one who saved me. I knew I needed you, even though I didn't know why, even though you weren't who you said you were. His fate thread wrapped around my waist, pulling me even closer to him. He leaned down and pressed his lips against mine, and I felt the heat against my face and burn inside my chest. I felt like I was flying, lighter than air, but more solid than I'd ever felt. My entire essence expanded to fill the sky, to touch the stars, to feel the rotation of the earth. All of it mine. And then I was free, my essence expelled from Jackie's body. She stumbled back from him. Michael and the others pulled her back behind them for protection. My contract was up. Alejandro turned to face the 4 Fenris. I was helpless again in my demon form. All I could do was watch. Chapter 8. I wanted to scream as the Fenris stepped forward. My own siblings starved to the point of insanity, but now I understood both sides. There was sorrow and happiness, pain and elation, doubt and friendship. I placed a hand on my chest and realized, even outside of Jackie's body, I had changed. I could still feel. I looked down and saw the emotions coiling out of my chest like ropes. The Fenris growled, all 4 of them on their feet, approaching Alejandro and the others, teeth bared, growling with the sound of grinding stones. I reached down and grabbed a purple strand of emotion. I swung it around, the way I would play with a strand of sorrow before sucking on it. I'd been told more than once not to play with my food, but now my own emotions were a physical thing. I knew what to do. I would make sure Alejandro didn't fail. I would fulfill my contract with Jackie Baxter, and I would give my friends a second chance at life. I would do all of that without a single reward or any thanks. I would do it because I wanted to, but the truth was, they'd already given me everything I could have hoped for, and this next part would be fun. 2 Fenris leaped at Alejandro at once. He was fast and agile and managed to twist around in time so that the claws missed his chest. The 4 friends attacked the other Fenris, hitting and swinging garbage at it, confusing its senses and making it retreat a few steps. Alejandro turned and swung his sword, driving back the beast before it could hurt the ordinaries. A 3rd Fenris leaped at Alejandro's back. I whipped out one of my emotional strands, flipping my wrist and pulling with a quick jerk. The emotion wrapped around the neck of the Fenris, pulling it to the ground. I used another emotion, like a lasso, catching the front legs of another Fenris. I jumped over Alejandro and hog-tied the Fenris with a red strand of emotion. I used my essence to darken the area, making it hard for the Fenris to see. Alejandro fought 2 Fenris at once, slashing through the air with the green blade, pushing the Fenris back toward the edge of the camp. I used a strand of emotion to pick up Jackie Baxter where she'd fallen on the ground. Her phone floated in front of her for an instant before her instincts kicked in. She grabbed the phone and started filming. The 4 friends received a helpful push from me, and they attacked the beast that lay tied by my emotions. Alejandro stabbed one Fenris through the head and swung around to catch the other one in the heart. He stood tall as he pulled out his sword, the essence of the Fenris scattering into dust around him. The 4th and final Fenris tried to lunge at Alejandro, but my emotions were still wrapped around its throat. Alejandro looked at Jackie, but then he followed the thread of emotion to look straight at me. The 4 ordinaries, using their makeshift weapons, delivered a final strike, and the 3rd Fenris disintegrated. Alejandro followed the guidance of his fate thread to cut the throat of the last beast. My essence shuddered as my emotion threads snapped back into me, but I stayed together. Neither Fenris nor sorrow-hungry demon. I was something else, and I had Alejandro to thank for it. Jackie Baxter held her phone steady, recording the video that would get her over 1 million views. I had a little bit of work left to do, but it could wait a moment. My essence was tired. Ha! Tired. That was an emotion, wasn't it? I sat on a bench near the edge of the sidewalk and watched Alejandro and the 4 ordinaries pat each other on the back, shaking hands and hugging. Alejandro wandered over to the bench I sat on, his face smudged with the black essence of the Fenris, his forehead sweaty from the battle. His fate thread nudged him, and he pulled a book from the pocket of his jacket, a small book of poems by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He set it on the bench, stood up, and walked away. I only rested for a moment. The recording Jackie took on her phone went viral. I confess, I probably watched it 100 times myself. The video was watched and shared with the label Heroes from the Trenches. I may have snuck into the phone and doctored the video just a little. There was no sign of Alejandro and his descendant weapon, only the Fenris and the bravery of the 4 friends as they saved the camp. Alejandro waited at the edge of the camp, standing like a guardian, blade by his side. The descendants came to clean up the mess, conveniently late. I watched from the park bench as the descendant shook Alejandro's hand, welcoming him to the Vale to train as a guardian. Alejandro nodded his acceptance and turned to follow the descendant to his car. He really was leaving to fight on the other side. We'd meet again, but I didn't know what that meeting would look like or where I'd be standing when the final battle came. Alejandro stopped and glanced back, looking straight at me one last time. He was good enough without proving it, but he was ready to make the world a better place exactly the way he was. I used a blue strand of emotion to open the book of poems and turn the page. To anyone watching, it would look like the brush of a breeze. Then I started to read, my strands of emotion growing brighter as I felt the words in the poems, catching a tear as I quietly said goodbye to the boy who had changed me, reveling in the taste of my own sorrow. This has been a production of Night Nook Publishing. All rights reserved. Copyright 2023. All characters and events in this story are fictitious, and any similarities to persons living or dead are purely coincidental. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. For news about cover reveals, new releases, and exclusive content, sign up for the Night Nook Publishing newsletter at www.nightnookpublishing.com. Thank you for listening.